Little girl was left alone in the city. Hell's Angels bikers' unexpected rescue will leave you in awe. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to the main character. It was a cold evening when Jake Reaper Morrison, a hardened Hells Angels biker, rolled his Harley through the empty streets of the city. His thoughts were consumed by the long ride ahead and the rush of freedom that only the open road could provide. The wind cut through the streets as he pushed forward, his mind far away from the urban chaos around him. But then, as his headlights flickered across the dark sidewalk, he saw her. A small figure huddled on the curb, her tiny body shaking in the cold. Jake slowed his bike, his instincts telling him to keep moving. He'd learned long ago not to get involved. But something about the sight of her, alone, vulnerable, her small face streaked with tears, stopped him in his tracks. The child looked up at him with wide eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't scream or run away, even as his massive bike loomed over her. Instead, she simply stared, her eyes pleading for help. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars, the sound of his engine the only thing that filled the silence between them. He hesitated for a moment, the roughness of his past urging him to keep riding, to ignore the girl and her pain. But something inside him, something long buried, made him pull the brake lever. He dismounted from his bike, his leather jacket creaking as he moved closer. The child didn't move, her face pale and weary from the weight of the world. "Are you okay?" Jake's voice was gruff, yet softer than usual, as if the words themselves carried an unexpected tenderness. The girl didn't answer. She just shook her head, her eyes welling up with fresh tears. Fragile form. He reached out a hand, offering her his warmth. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm here to help you." The girl hesitated for a moment before looking up at him, her small hand shaking as she reached for his. Jake carefully lifted her into his arms, his heart heavy with the weight of her fear. She smelled of the street, dirt, loneliness, and a desperation that Jake knew all too well. He could see the bruise on her cheek, the signs of neglect and pain in her tired eyes. She was just a child, abandoned in the city with no one to care for her. But that was about to change. Jake could feel the girl's small body trembling against him as he stood up, his mind racing with the questions he hadn't thought to ask. Who had left her here? Why? But there was no time for that. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," Jake muttered under his breath, the promise of protection echoing in his own mind. As he carried her back to his bike, the world seemed to stand still. The cold city streets, the noise of the traffic, everything faded away. In that moment, it was just Jake and this little girl, two souls brought together by an unlikely twist of fate. He knew the dangers of the road, the violence that lurked in the shadows of his past, but none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was getting her to safety. With the girl securely behind him, clutching tightly to his jacket, Jake revved the engine, the roar of his bike signaling the start of a new chapter. The night was far from over, but in this moment, he had one mission: to keep her safe. The road stretched out ahead, dark and unpredictable, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave her alone in the city. Not this time. The bike roared to life, its engine cutting through the still night air as Jake sped down the quiet streets. Emma clung to him, her small hands gripping his jacket, her body pressed against his back for warmth and comfort. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting shadows that seemed to follow them as they moved forward. Jake could feel the weight of her fear, her trust in him growing with every passing second. He had never been one to care about others, especially not children. But something about her, the way she had looked at him with those wide, innocent eyes, made him want to protect her at all costs. The road stretched out ahead of them, dark and endless, but Jake didn't mind. For the first time in years, he had a sense of purpose. He wasn't just riding for himself anymore, he was riding for her. The wind whipped past them as they made their way toward Jake's garage, the place he had called home for far too long. It was an old building on the outskirts of town, filled with the remnants of a life he had left behind. The faint smell of motor oil and dust filled the air as Jake parked the bike, and helped Emma off. She wobbled a little as her feet hit the ground, still unsteady from the cold and the shock of the night. "You're safe now," Jake said, his voice rough, yet comforting. Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and tired. Jake didn't say anything. Instead, he led her into the garage, the door creaking as it opened. The space inside was cluttered with tools, bikes, and old parts, but it had a certain warmth to it. It was a far cry from the life he used to lead, but it was his sanctuary. Jake gestured to the small cot in the corner. "You can sleep there," he said. "I'll get you some water." Emma nodded, too exhausted to say anything else. She walked over to the cot and sat down, wrapping her arms around herself to ward off the chill. Jake turned and grabbed a bottle of water from the counter, handing it to her when he returned. "Drink up," he told her. Emma took a small sip, her hands still trembling. "Are you hungry?" Jake asked, watching her closely. Emma nodded slowly. "A little." Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed a few cans of soup from the shelf, setting them on the stove to heat up. As the smell of the food filled the air, Emma's eyes began to close. Jake couldn't help but notice how fragile she looked, how small and helpless in the vast space around them. He wasn't used to caring about anyone, especially not like this. But something about Emma made him want to change that. He wasn't sure how or why, but he knew he couldn't just walk away from her. The soup was ready in a few minutes, and Jake brought it over to her. He set the bowl down in front of her, watching as she took a bite. Her face lit up with relief as she tasted the warm food. "Thank you," she said again, this time with more strength in her voice. Jake nodded, not knowing what else to say. He sat down across from her, the weight of the night settling over them both. "You're safe here," he finally said. "I'll make sure of it." Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and trust. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. Jake paused, his gaze drifting to the old pictures on the wall, the faces of people from a life he no longer recognized. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "Maybe because I wish someone had helped me when I needed it." Emma studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're different," she whispered. Jake felt a pang in his chest at her words. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. He was far from the kind of person she should look up to. But in that moment, he realized it didn't matter. He would protect her, no matter what. As the night stretched on, the world outside grew quieter, the storm passing by without a sound. But inside the garage, there was a sense of calm, a sense of safety that neither Jake nor Emma had known for a long time. The bond between them was just beginning to form, but Jake could already feel it, strong and unshakable. Emma finished her meal and curled up on the cot, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. Jake sat nearby, watching her sleep, his mind racing with thoughts he didn't want to confront. He had never been a protector, never cared about anything other than the club, the road, and the chaos he had created for himself. But now, with Emma there, things were different. He was different, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the night wore on, Jake knew that his life had just changed forever. He wasn't sure how or why, but he would do whatever it took to keep Emma safe. That was a promise he was willing to make, a promise he would keep. The morning light filtered through the cracked windows of the garage, casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Jake sat at his workbench, his hands absent-mindedly running over the tools, each one familiar, each one tied to a different chapter of his life. The garage had become his refuge, a place where he could lose himself in the mechanical world, away from the chaos of his past. But today, it felt different. The quiet was no longer enough to drown out the thoughts in his mind. He glanced over at the cot where Emma slept, her small form tucked beneath a blanket. She was safe here, for now, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he had just brought her into something much larger than either of them could have anticipated. The storm from the night before had passed, but the tension in the air remained, thick and heavy. Jake had always been a lone wolf, living by his own rules, with no one to answer to but himself. But now, he had someone to protect, someone who depended on him. He didn't know how to handle that responsibility, but he knew he had no choice. He couldn't just turn his back on her. Emma stirred, waking slowly, her eyes blinking as she adjusted to the light. She sat up and rubbed her eyes, looking around the room as if trying to remember where she was. "Morning," Jake said, his voice low and gruff, as he stood up and walked over to the small stove. You hungry? Emma nodded, still a bit dazed. A little. Jake opened a can of soup, the hiss of the metal can echoing in the stillness. As the soup heated up, he turned to look at Emma, who was now sitting on the edge of the cot, her legs dangling off the side. She looked so small, so fragile, and it hurt Jake to see her like this. He had seen too many broken people in his life, too many who had been abandoned or left to fend for themselves. He had always been the one to walk away, to leave the mess behind. But this time he couldn't. You ever been on a bike before? Jake asked, trying to make small talk, to break the silence that hung between them. Emma shook her head. No, she said quietly. I always wanted to though. Jake gave a small chuckle, though it felt foreign on his lips. It's not what you think. It's loud, it's cold, and you're never really sure if you're going to make it to the next stop. But it's freedom. Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. Freedom? Jake nodded, his fingers absently tracing the rim of the pot. Yeah, it's the only time I feel like I'm in control. The road doesn't care who you are or where you came from. It's just you and the bike. Emma's gaze softened, and for a moment, Jake saw something in her eyes that reminded him of himself, of the lost kid he used to be. Maybe one day, she said. Jake didn't answer, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. He finished heating the soup and set it down in front of her. Eat up, he said gruffly. You'll need your strength. Emma picked up the spoon and took a small bite, savoring the warmth. For a moment, everything felt normal again. But Jake knew better than to believe in normal. His past was a storm that never quite passed, and he had a feeling Emma's past was just as dark. He didn't know how to fix it, how to make things right for her. But he would try. As the day went on, Jake found himself doing things he hadn't done in years, caring for someone, making sure they were okay, putting someone else's needs before his own. It was foreign to him, uncomfortable even. But when he saw the trust in Emma's eyes, when he saw how she looked to him for safety, for protection, something in him stirred. He couldn't turn back now. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the garage, Jake took a deep breath and looked at Emma. We'll figure this out, he said, more to himself than to her. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with hope. Where? She asked softly. Jake's jaw tightened. I'm not sure yet, he said. But we'll find a way. We always do. With that, he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, the sound of his boots echoing in the empty garage. Emma followed him, her small steps hesitant but steady. As they walked out into the evening, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the world was watching them, waiting to see what they would do next. But he didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he had something worth fighting for. The night was quiet, the only sound being the occasional rustle of the wind outside the garage. Jake sat on a worn-out stool, his eyes locked on the faint glow of the single light hanging overhead. Emma was asleep on the cot, wrapped in blankets, the peace of the moment oddly calming. But Jake knew peace was fleeting. The city outside wasn't kind to people like her, people like him. It had a way of swallowing you whole, and he wasn't sure how long they could stay hidden here. He glanced over at her, her small face peaceful in sleep, a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty she had carried just hours ago. For the first time in a long while, Jake found himself unsure of the road ahead. He had spent his life chasing freedom, but this, protecting someone else, felt like a new kind of burden, one he hadn't prepared for. But he couldn't turn his back on her. Not now. He had made a promise to keep her safe, and that was something he wouldn't break. He stood up slowly, the sound of his boots heavy against the concrete floor. The garage was quiet, just the way he liked it. But there was something different about this place now. It wasn't just a workshop, it was a refuge. For both of them. The low hum of the Harley in the corner reminded him of his past, of the life he had left behind when he walked away from the club. But now, looking at Emma, he realized that maybe there was more to life than the road. Maybe it wasn't all about riding solo, doing whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Maybe it was about something bigger. Jake stepped outside, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. He looked up at the dark sky, the stars barely visible through the haze of city lights. His mind raced with thoughts of Emma and the life she had left behind. What kind of world had she come from? What had happened to her family? These were questions Jake didn't have answers to, and for the first time, he realized he didn't need to know. He would protect her, no matter what. That was enough for now. He turned back toward the garage and walked back inside, his footsteps purposeful. Emma was still asleep, her breathing steady and calm. He couldn't help but feel a sense of relief at seeing her so at ease. It was a small victory, but it meant something. Jake wasn't used to feeling like this, responsible, protective. He had always been the one people relied on for strength, but now, with Emma, he was the one who had to be strong. He wasn't sure how he was going to handle it, but he would figure it out. For her. He went over to the workbench and picked up a wrench, his fingers absently tracing the worn handle. The garage had always been his sanctuary, a place to lose himself in the rhythm of fixing bikes, the hum of machines, the smell of motor oil. But now, as he worked, his thoughts kept drifting back to Emma. What was her life like before this? Was she always alone? Did she have anyone? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the door. He turned to find Emma standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "What's wrong?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. Emma stepped inside, her small frame almost swallowed up by the oversized jacket Jake had given her. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice soft. Jake set the wrench down and motioned for her to come closer. "You want some water?" She nodded, her eyes glancing nervously around the room. Jake could tell she was still adjusting to the unfamiliarity of everything. The garage, the warmth, the safety. It wasn't home, but for now it would do. As he handed her a cup of water, he couldn't help but notice the way she clutched it in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. She was still scared, still unsure of the world around her. But that was okay. Jake didn't have all the answers, but he had something more important. He had the ability to protect her. And that was enough for now. "You're safe here," Jake said, his voice low and reassuring. Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "But what if they come looking for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake felt a pang in his chest at her words. He wasn't sure who she was talking about, but he knew the fear was real. "No one's going to find you," Jake said, his voice firm. "Not as long as I'm here." Emma's gaze softened, and for the first time, she smiled. A small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was the first real smile Jake had seen from her, and it felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a sense of understanding. He didn't need to say anything more. The bond between them was already forming, stronger than any words could express. And in that moment, Jake realized that maybe he had found something worth fighting for. Maybe the road didn't have to be a solitary one. Maybe, just maybe, he had found a new purpose. As the night stretched on, Jake sat in silence, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't need them. He had Emma, and that was enough. The storm had passed, but Jake knew there would be more challenges ahead. There always were. But as long as he had Emma by his side, he knew they could face anything. Together. The morning sun crept through the broken blinds, casting a soft light across the garage. Jake sat at his workbench, the familiar hum of the tools and machinery a steady presence in the background. His hands worked with mechanical precision, but his mind was elsewhere, constantly drifting back to Emma. She had been with him for several days now, and though she was still adjusting, there was something in her eyes that made Jake believe they were both starting to settle into a new rhythm. Emma had come to rely on him, and Jake, in turn, found himself looking out for her more than he had ever looked out for anyone. He had always been alone, doing what he had to do to survive. But with her in his life, everything felt different. The responsibility weighed on him, yes, but it also brought a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He was a protector, a guardian. And that thought, as strange as it felt, gave him something to fight for. It had been a few days since the storm, and the weather had cleared up. The world outside the garage was calm, the sky a pale blue with only a few clouds drifting lazily by. But inside, Jake felt the tension of the days ahead. He knew Emma wasn't completely safe yet. They both knew that. There was a lot more to her story than she had shared, and Jake could sense that she was holding back. He wasn't going to push her, but he couldn't help but wonder what she had been running from, and what she was hiding. Jake glanced over at Emma, who was sitting quietly on the cot, her legs tucked beneath her as she read a book. It was an old book, one that had clearly been well-loved. She looked so small in the large space, her presence somehow filling the empty corners of the garage. She had changed since the first day he found her. There was a lightness in her eyes now, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. Jake wasn't sure what had shifted, but he knew that something had. Maybe it was the safety she felt here, or maybe it was the trust that was slowly building between them. He didn't know, but he was determined to protect it. He stood up from the workbench and walked over to her, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. "How are you doing today?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emma looked up at him, her eyes warm. "I'm okay," she replied softly, giving him a small smile. "I was just reading." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning her face. She was okay, physically at least. But emotionally, Jake could sense there was still a wall up. And that was fine. He wasn't in a hurry for her to open up. He just wanted her to know that when she was ready, he would be there to listen. "That's good," Jake said. "It's important to keep your mind busy." Emma nodded, then went back to her book. For a moment, Jake stood there, watching her, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He couldn't help her carry her past, but he could help her with her future. And that was what mattered now. He turned away from her and walked to the door, stepping outside into the cool morning air. The world outside seemed different somehow, as though it was waiting for something. Jake wasn't sure what, but he could feel it in his bones. He had spent most of his life running, always moving forward, never looking back. But now, with Emma by his side, he couldn't help but wonder if maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to make a stand. He had always been a loner, always believed that the road was the only place he could truly be free. But with Emma, he felt a different kind of freedom, a freedom that came from knowing he had someone to protect, someone to care for. And as much as the road had given him, it had also taken away. He had lost so much along the way, and he wasn't sure how much more he could afford to lose. Emma was different. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't just a part of his past. She was a part of his future. And Jake knew that he couldn't let her go. He had to keep her safe, no matter the cost. The thought of losing her, of failing her, filled him with a sense of dread. But he pushed it aside, focusing instead on what needed to be done. They couldn't stay in the garage forever. Jake knew they had to move on, but where? And more importantly, how would they do it? He wasn't sure, but he would figure it out. For her. He turned back toward the garage and walked inside, his mind already racing with the possibilities of the day ahead. Emma was still reading, her eyes focused on the pages, but when she saw him enter, she looked up. "What are we doing today?" she asked, her voice bright with curiosity. Jake smiled, his heart lightening at the sound of her voice. "I don't know yet," he said, walking over to the workbench. "But whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Emma smiled back, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had each other, and that was enough. Together, they would face whatever the world threw their way. They would figure it out. They always did. The morning sun was already high in the sky when Jake stepped outside, taking a deep breath of fresh air. It felt like a new beginning, the kind of fresh start he hadn't known in years. The garage, his refuge from the world, seemed quieter today, as if it too was waiting for something. Emma had stayed inside, reading the same book she had been flipping through for days, the comfort of routine settling into her bones. But for Jake, the world felt different. It had been a few days since they had decided to move on, and the road ahead wasn't clear. But one thing was certain. He couldn't keep hiding forever. He couldn't keep running from his past, and neither could Emma. As much as he wanted to protect her, he knew that they both needed to face what was coming. He couldn't keep her in the safety of the garage forever. He had to find a way to get her out of this situation, to give her a chance at something better. But where would they go? What would they do? Jake wasn't sure, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. He had a few contacts in the city, people he hadn't spoken to in years, but who might still owe him a favor. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option he had. As he paced in front of the garage, his thoughts raced. He didn't want to drag Emma into the chaos of his old life, but he knew he didn't have a choice. The world outside the garage was dangerous, and he couldn't protect her in a small town forever. He had to get them both out. But where? He stopped in his tracks, an idea suddenly forming in his mind. The road, the one he had spent so many years riding, was still there. It wasn't just a way out of the past, it was a path to freedom. Maybe it wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a start. It was better than staying here, in this place that felt too much like a dead end. He turned back toward the garage, his mind made up. It was time to leave. He opened the door, finding Emma exactly where he had left her. She looked up at him as he stepped inside, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Jake walked over to her, his steps purposeful. "We're leaving," he said, his voice firm. "It's time to move on." Emma didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Jake could see the wheels turning in her mind, could feel the uncertainty that lingered between them. He knelt down beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I know you're scared," he said quietly, "but we can't stay here. It's not safe." Emma's eyes filled with emotion as she looked up at him. "Where will we go?" she asked softly. Jake hesitated for a moment, the weight of the question heavy on his chest. He didn't have a clear answer, but he knew he had to try. "We'll figure it out," he said, offering her a small smile. "I promise you, Emma. We'll find a way." Emma nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. Jake could see the trust in them, the hope that had begun to grow since they had met. She wasn't the same scared girl he had found on the street. She had changed, and so had he. He stood up, offering her his hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's get moving." Emma took his hand without hesitation, and together, they stepped out of the garage and into the unknown. The road stretched out ahead of them, a path they would walk together. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be obstacles along the way. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he had something worth fighting for. They had each other, and that was enough. The city faded behind them as they drove, the hum of the bike filling the silence. Emma clung to him, her small body pressed against his back, her head resting on his shoulder. The ride was long, and the world outside seemed to blur, but Jake didn't mind. He had found something more important than the road. He had found a reason to keep moving forward. As they drove through the city, Jake couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror. It wasn't just the city they were leaving behind. It was his past, and he wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. They were in this together, and that was all that mattered. The road ahead stretched long and unbroken, the hum of the Harley's engine steady beneath them. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars, his mind still processing the decision they had made. The world outside was vast, the city they had left behind fading into the rearview mirror, replaced by miles of open roads. Emma was tucked close to his back, her small hands holding on to him as though she had already started to trust him more than she trusted anyone in her past. The wind whipped around them, but for Jake, the ride felt oddly quiet. It wasn't the usual kind of silence he'd been used to, the kind of isolation that came with riding solo. This silence was different. There was a soft presence behind him, a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. And as much as he tried to block it out, he couldn't ignore the weight of responsibility that came with having someone to care for. It was a different kind of weight, one that wasn't a burden but a strange comfort. The road was no longer just about the escape. It was about something more. They had left everything behind, not just the city but the ghosts of Jake's past, the reckless choices, the years of running away. Now, they were moving forward, into something unknown but together. It had been hours, and the sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon. Jake glanced over at Emma, who was looking out at the world passing by, her hair tangled by the wind. He couldn't help but smile, her wide-eyed wonder reminding him of the child he used to be. She was so different from the scared girl he had found in the city. She was beginning to look like someone who believed, maybe for the first time in a long time, that the world could be something more than a place of fear and pain. It made him feel like they were both getting a second chance. "How are you doing back there?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Emma didn't answer at first, but he could feel her squeeze his waist tighter. "I'm okay," she replied after a moment. Her voice was steady, and there was something in it that made Jake believe she truly was okay. It was a small thing, but it was enough. He had seen too many people fake being okay, but there was nothing fake about Emma. She wasn't hiding behind a mask. She was simply surviving. "Good," Jake said, his eyes back on the road. He could feel the weight of her gaze on his back, but he didn't mind. It was a comforting presence, one that made him feel more human than he had in years. The miles passed, and they rode through small towns, past wide-open fields, and through quiet stretches of forest. It was peaceful, but Jake knew they couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, they would have to stop. They would need a place to rest, a place to figure out what came next. But for now, he had no answers. He just had the road and Emma. And that was enough. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon when they came across a small diner on the side of the road. It was the kind of place that seemed out of time, an old-fashioned truck stop with neon signs that flickered in the evening light. Jake pulled over, the engine of the Harley dying down as they came to a stop. Emma climbed off the bike, her legs shaky from the long ride. She stretched, yawning softly as she looked up at the diner. "Is it okay to stop here?" she asked, her voice a little uncertain. Jake nodded. "We'll grab something to eat, get some rest, and then figure out where to go from here." He looked at her, his gaze soft. "You can't keep running forever, but we'll take it one step at a time." Emma nodded, her eyes still full of that same quiet determination. Jake smiled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. As they walked into the diner, the door jingled softly, announcing their arrival. The air inside was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and greasy diner food. The waitress behind the counter looked up and smiled at them, her expression friendly but tired. "What can I get you folks?" she asked, her voice a little hoarse from the long shift. Jake looked at the menu on the wall, then at Emma. "Just a couple of burgers and fries," he said, his voice calm. "And a couple of sodas." The waitress nodded and went to the back to put in the order. Jake and Emma sat down at a booth by the window, the dim light from the neon sign outside casting a soft glow over the table. Jake didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to rush ahead. They had made it this far, and that was enough. For now, he would focus on the present, on Emma, on the small moments that made everything else fade away. As they waited for their food, Jake looked out the window at the world passing by. The road would always be there, a reminder of his past. But for the first time, it didn't feel like the only thing worth chasing. There was something else now, something more important. And as he looked back at Emma, her face bathed in the soft light of the diner, he realized he was ready to face whatever came next. Together, the diner was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt natural after the rush of the morning had passed. Jake and Emma had finished their meal, the plates cleared, but neither of them was in a hurry to leave. Jake sat back, his hands folded in front of him on the table, his eyes drifting out the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow across the landscape, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. Emma, on the other hand, was fiddling with the edges of her napkin, her gaze focused on the small details around her. It was a peaceful moment, one that Jake wasn't sure would last. "Are we staying here for the night?" Emma asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but there was something in it that made Jake pause. He wasn't sure if she was asking because she was scared or because she was starting to feel at home, but either way, the question hit him hard. He had spent most of his life running, always moving, always looking for the next place to go. But with Emma, the thought of staying in one place for a while didn't seem so bad. "We can stay for the night," Jake replied, his voice steady, though his mind was still working through the next steps. "But we can't stay here forever. We'll need to figure out where we're going next." Emma nodded quietly, her eyes meeting his. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to go back to where we were before." Jake felt a pang in his chest at her words. He hadn't asked her about her past, not in detail, anyway, but he could tell it wasn't good. He had seen the way she flinched when someone raised their voice, the way she seemed to shrink in on herself whenever something reminded her of her old life. But that wasn't her life anymore, not as long as she was with him. "You won't have to," Jake said firmly, leaning forward just a little. "I won't let anything happen to you." The words came out stronger than he had intended, but Emma didn't flinch this time. Instead, she met his gaze, her eyes wide but filled with a quiet kind of understanding. She had already begun to trust him, and that meant more to him than he had realized. There was a long pause between them, both of them lost in their own thoughts, before the waitress came over with the check. Jake didn't hesitate to reach for his wallet, pulling out enough cash to cover the meal and a generous tip. As he stood up to leave, he looked over at Emma, who was still sitting at the booth, her eyes focused on something outside. He didn't know what she was thinking, but he could guess. She was still processing everything, still coming to terms with the fact that she had a chance at something different, something better. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. "You ready?" Jake asked, his voice calm, but with an underlying warmth. Emma nodded, standing up slowly. Yeah, let's go. They left the diner together, stepping back out into the cool evening air. The Harley was still parked in front, waiting for them. As they approached the bike, Jake felt the familiar weight of the helmet in his hand. But this time, he wasn't thinking about the road ahead. This time, he was thinking about Emma and how, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose beyond himself. He handed her the helmet, and she took it without hesitation. You're sure about this? Jake asked, his voice softer now. Yeah, Emma replied, a small but determined smile crossing her face. I trust you. Jake's heart clenched at her words, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he nodded and helped her onto the back of the bike. As they started the engine and pulled away from the diner, Jake felt a sense of calm settle over him. He didn't know what the future held, and he didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. They were in this together, and that was enough. The road stretched out before them, dark and winding, but Jake wasn't focused on the destination anymore. He was focused on the journey they were going to take together. And for the first time, that felt like the right road to be on. The road stretched out in front of them, the wind rushing by as Jake and Emma made their way through the darkening landscape. The sun had fully set now, leaving only the soft glow of distant streetlights to guide them. The bike hummed steadily beneath them, a constant reminder of the journey they were on. Jake could feel Emma's hands wrapped tightly around his waist, her small presence grounding him in a way he had never expected. The night had fallen silent, the kind of quiet that always followed the chaos of the day. But this silence was different. It was peaceful. Jake had been used to the noise of the road, the engines, the shouting, the constant movement. But with Emma behind him, the world felt different. It felt still. For the first time in years, he wasn't focused on the past, on running or escaping. He was focused on her. And that was something he hadn't realized he needed until now. He stole a glance at Emma over his shoulder, her face framed by the glow of the headlights. She looked calm, despite the uncertainty that had surrounded her since the day they met. Her eyes were fixed ahead, her small body pressed against his back, but there was something about the way she held herself that made Jake believe she was starting to feel safe. Safe. The word echoed in his mind as they rode on. He had always lived in a world where safety was a luxury, something that only existed for people who didn't have to fight for it. But now, with Emma, he realized that maybe it wasn't about fighting to survive anymore. Maybe it was about finding a place where they both could belong. The thought caught him off guard. A place where they could both belong. Jake had never thought much about belonging. He had always been a lone wolf, moving from one place to the next, never stopping long enough to put down roots. But with Emma, something had shifted. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he had a purpose again. She had become that purpose. He glanced up at the road ahead, taking in the twists and turns as they continued their journey. The night felt endless, but in the best way possible. There were no deadlines, no urgent destinations. There was just the road, and the promise of whatever came next. Where are we going? Emma's voice cut through the silence, soft but steady. Jake took a moment before answering, his eyes scanning the road ahead. I'm not sure, he said honestly. But we'll figure it out. Emma didn't press for more information. She simply nodded, her small head resting gently against his back. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. She was trusting him, following him into the unknown, and that meant more to him than anything. The miles seemed to stretch on forever, the only sound between them the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind. Jake wasn't sure where they were headed, but he knew they couldn't stay on the road forever. They would need a place to rest, a place to gather their thoughts and plan for whatever was next. But for now, he didn't want to think about that. He just wanted to keep riding. As the night wore on, Jake's mind began to wander. He thought about the years he had spent running, about the life he had left behind. He had spent so much time focused on the next destination, the next escape, that he had never stopped to think about what he was leaving behind. But with Emma, it felt different. She had reminded him that maybe it wasn't about running anymore. Maybe it was about staying. The thought seemed foreign to him, but it felt right. He wasn't sure what would come of this journey, of the road they were on, but he knew one thing. He wasn't alone anymore. They had each other, and that was enough. It was a few hours later when they finally found a small town on the outskirts of a forest. It wasn't much, just a few buildings and a couple of streetlights, but it was quiet, peaceful. Jake slowed the bike as they entered the town, his eyes scanning the area for a place to stop. They needed to rest, and this seemed as good a place as any. He pulled up to a small motel with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. It wasn't fancy, but it would do for the night. Jake cut the engine and helped Emma off the bike, his muscles sore from the long ride. "How's it feel to be off the bike?" he asked, turning to her with a small smile. Emma stretched, her arms reaching up toward the sky. "Good," she said. "I think I'm ready for a real bed." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." He walked to the door of the motel and pushed it open, the bell above it ringing softly. The receptionist behind the counter looked up, offering them a friendly smile. "Need a room for the night?" she asked, her voice warm. Jake nodded, handing her some cash. "Yeah, just for tonight." She gave him a key, and Jake led Emma down the hallway to their room. It was small, but the bed looked comfortable enough. Jake set down his bag and flopped down on the bed, letting out a long breath. "I never thought I'd be staying in a place like this," he said with a smile. Emma sat down beside him, her eyes taking in the room. "It's nice," she said softly. "It feels safe." Jake didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her, at the quiet trust in her eyes. "Yeah," he finally said. "It does." As the night fell around them, the two of them settled in, their minds at ease for the first time in a long while. The road had brought them here, and for tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they were together. And that, in itself, was a kind of peace. The morning sun crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the room. Jake stretched out on the bed, the covers tangled around him, a few aches in his muscles from the long ride. He hadn't been able to rest like this in a long time. No constant running, no watching over his shoulder. Just quiet. He could feel the weight of the day ahead, but for now, it was easy to let himself be still, even if just for a moment. Emma was still asleep in the bed across the room, her small form curled up under the blankets. Jake watched her for a moment, the peacefulness of her sleep reminding him of how much she had come to mean to him. She had been through so much, but here, in the quiet of the motel room, she seemed almost normal, like a child again, free from the weight of whatever had happened before. Jake stood and quietly moved toward the window, looking out at the small town that seemed frozen in time. The streets were quiet, the morning stillness only interrupted by the occasional car driving by. He couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the small moments like this, moments that felt like they could be part of a new life. A life with Emma. They had only been on the road for a few days, but it felt like they had come a long way. Physically, yes, but emotionally as well. They were both starting to heal, in their own ways. Emma had told him a little about her past, just enough to let him know that she had known far too much pain. Jake didn't press her for more. He knew what it was like to carry the weight of secrets, and he wasn't about to force her to share more than she was ready to. He didn't have all the answers, but he was beginning to understand what it meant to protect someone, to be there for them in a way that was more than just keeping them safe from physical harm. It was about showing up, about proving that they didn't have to be alone anymore. "Hey." Emma's voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see her sitting up on the bed, rubbing her eyes. "Morning," Jake said, giving her a small smile. "You sleep okay?" Emma nodded slowly, her expression softening. "Yeah, better than I have in a while." Jake's heart warmed at her words. "Good," he said, walking over to the small table by the window. "I was thinking we could head out after breakfast. There's a place a few miles down. The road that might have what we need." Emma looked up at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do we need?" she asked, her voice curious. "Just supplies," Jake said, his eyes meeting hers. "Things for the road. We'll need food and maybe some gas." She nodded, her small hands gripping the edge of the bed. "Okay," she said quietly, as if still processing everything. Jake could see that she was still adjusting, still figuring out where she fit in all of this. He didn't have all the answers, but he was trying to be patient, to show her that there was no rush. They had time to figure things out. The room was quiet again as Jake moved around, grabbing his things and preparing to leave. Emma stood and walked over to the small mirror by the door, brushing her hair out of her face. She was still adjusting to the life they were leading, but Jake could see the quiet strength in her, the determination that was starting to shine through. She wasn't the scared, lost girl he had found in the city. She was becoming someone else, someone stronger. He felt proud of her, even if he didn't fully understand everything she had been through. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would protect her, no matter what. He had a sense that the journey they were on was only just beginning. The road was uncertain, but they didn't have to face it alone. Together, they would figure it out. They would keep moving forward, one step at a time. Jake grabbed his jacket and walked toward the door, holding it open for Emma. She gave him a small smile, the first real one he had seen in days, and followed him out into the morning light. The world was still out there, full of uncertainty and unknowns, but for now, they had each other. That was enough. The sun had risen high above the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the small town as Jake and Emma made their way down the road. The bike hummed beneath them, the engine steady and comforting. It had been a quiet morning, but Jake could feel the tension building in the air. They had been on the road for days now, moving from place to place, always with one eye on the horizon. The unknown loomed ahead of them, but for the first time in a long while, Jake wasn't afraid. He had Emma with him, and that made everything feel more possible. They were in this together. As they passed through the town, Jake slowed the bike and glanced at the gas station up ahead. He could see a few trucks parked out front, the drivers inside talking over cups of coffee. It seemed like a good place to stop for a moment, to check in, rest for a bit, and gather their thoughts before they continued. He pulled the bike to a stop, and Emma climbed off, stretching her legs after the long ride. She seemed more at ease now, the constant tension in her shoulders slowly fading with each passing day. They were both finding a new normal. Jake looked at her for a moment, his eyes studying her face. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low. Emma looked up at him, her eyes soft. "Yeah," she said, giving him a small smile. "I think I'm starting to get used to it." Jake nodded, though he didn't entirely believe her. He knew she was still processing everything. The change, the uncertainty, the fear that had been with her for so long. But he also knew that she was strong. She was stronger than she thought. They walked into the gas station, the door creaking as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of fresh coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above, and the clink of the cash register rang out every few seconds as customers came and went. Jake went up to the counter to pay for gas, while Emma stood off to the side, looking around the small shop. She didn't seem to know exactly what she was looking for, but she was taking it all in, absorbing the normalcy of it all. She was used to the chaos of city life, to the feeling of being on the run. But this was different. It felt safe. As Jake finished paying, he turned to Emma, who was now holding a small packet of candy in her hands. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a hint of excitement. "Yeah," she said almost shyly. Jake smiled and reached into his pocket for some cash. He grabbed a couple of energy bars and a bag of chips, then walked back to Emma. "Here," he said, handing her the snacks. She took them from him with a smile, her fingers brushing his hand for just a moment. Jake felt the warmth of the gesture, the simple trust that was beginning to grow between them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They were both still figuring things out, but they were doing it together. After a few minutes, they stepped back outside into the cool air. The bike was ready, and the road called to them once more. But for the first time, Jake didn't feel the rush to get away. He didn't feel the pull of the past urging him forward. He felt calm, steady. He felt like he could face whatever was coming. They climbed back onto the bike, and Jake started the engine. As they rode down the road, the world around them felt both vast and small. They were alone, just the two of them, but there was a sense of connection that went beyond words. It was the kind of bond that could only be forged through shared experiences, through surviving together. As they rode, Jake thought about the future, about what it held for them. They still didn't have a plan, and they still didn't know where they were going. But that was okay. For now, they had the road, and that was enough. Emma's arms were wrapped tightly around him, her head resting against his back as the wind rushed past them. The sound of the bike, the rush of the air, it all felt like a new beginning. It was more than just the road. They were building something together, something stronger than either of them had ever known. The sun was beginning to set again as they entered a new town. The familiar pull of the unknown was there, but it didn't feel as daunting anymore. As Jake slowed the bike and pulled into another gas station, he looked at Emma, who was already scanning the area. "We'll stop here for the night," he said, his voice steady. "Get some rest." Emma nodded, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. She had come a long way since he had first found her, and so had he. They were both changing, growing, and the journey they were on was just beginning. As they stepped off the bike, Jake knew that no matter where the road took them next, they would face it together. That was all that mattered. The day had started like any other, but as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jake found himself thinking more about the future than he had in a long time. They had been on the road for a while now, moving from place to place, but the weight of their journey was starting to settle on his shoulders. They couldn't keep running forever. Jake wasn't sure where the road would take them next, but he knew they had to keep moving. The town they had stopped in the night before was small, but it had its own kind of charm. A few shops lined the main street, and a small diner sat at the corner. As Jake and Emma made their way through the town, Jake could feel the weight of the decisions ahead of them. He couldn't help but think about Emma's future. She had already been through so much, and he didn't want to lead her down a path that would only bring more pain. But as they walked, something began to settle in his heart. For the first time in a long time, Jake realized that he wasn't just trying to protect Emma. He was trying to give her something better, something he hadn't had in years: hope. They stopped for breakfast at the diner, a small, cozy place with faded booths and a counter full of regulars. The waitress, an older woman with a warm smile, greeted them as they sat down. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice friendly. Jake glanced at the menu before looking up at Emma. "Pancakes and coffee," he said, and Emma nodded beside him, ordering the same. As they waited for their food, Jake couldn't help but notice the quiet comfort of the diner. It felt like a momentary escape from the chaos of the world outside. For once, there were no threats hanging over them, no looming danger, just the simple act of sitting down and sharing a meal. Emma was quiet, her eyes scanning the room as she sipped her water. Jake studied her for a moment, watching how much she had changed since he first met her. She wasn't the scared girl who had hidden behind walls. She was growing into someone stronger, someone who was beginning to trust again. It made Jake feel like maybe, just maybe, they could build something new together. Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence. It wasn't much, just pancakes and coffee, but it felt like everything they needed in that moment. Jake finished his meal first and sat back, glancing around the diner. It was an ordinary place, with no grand story to tell. But for him and Emma, it felt like a new beginning. They couldn't stay in the diner forever, though. There was still the rest of the world to face. "We'll head out after breakfast," Jake said, his voice calm. "Find a place to rest for the night. We'll keep moving tomorrow." Emma nodded, a small smile on her face. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. Jake thought about it for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window, where the world outside seemed so vast. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But we'll figure it out, one step at a time." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet trust. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in her, in the way she was handling everything. They had both come a long way since that night on the road. Jake had always been a man of few words, but for once, he didn't need to say much. They were in this together, and that was enough. After they finished eating, Jake paid the bill, and they left the diner. They stood outside for a moment, the cool morning air brushing against their faces. The bike was waiting for them, ready to take them wherever they decided to go next. Emma climbed onto the back, settling against him as he started the engine. Jake turned to her, his voice softer than usual. "You good?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers. She smiled and nodded, her arms wrapping around his waist. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady. "I'm good." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time, he felt like they were truly moving forward. Not just physically, but emotionally. They were starting to rebuild, one step at a time. He revved the engine, and they pulled out of the small town, the open road stretching out ahead of them. Jake wasn't sure where they were going, but he knew they were headed in the right direction. Together, they would face whatever the future held. The ride was quiet for a while, the sound of the bike's engine the only thing breaking the silence. Emma's grip tightened slightly as they passed fields and forests, the landscape passing by in a blur. Jake's mind wandered for a moment, thinking about what the next chapter of their journey would look like. He didn't have all the answers, but he had a feeling that with Emma by his side, they would find a way to make it work. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, it felt like it was leading them somewhere. They rode through the day, stopping occasionally for gas and food, each small stop bringing them closer to something new. By the time the sun began to set, they had reached another small town, and Jake decided it was time to rest. They pulled into a modest motel, the neon sign flickering slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the night. Jake helped Emma off the bike, and they made their way inside. The room was simple, just a bed and a few chairs, but it felt like a haven compared to the uncertainty of the road. As they settled in for the night, Jake knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more questions. But for now, they were safe. And that was enough. The next morning came with a quiet promise of change. Jake stretched as he woke up, the faint light of dawn slipping through the blinds and casting a soft glow across the room. He hadn't slept much, but that was nothing new. The road had always kept him awake, always keeping his mind busy with thoughts of where he'd been and where he was going. But this morning was different. He wasn't alone in this journey anymore. His gaze flickered over to the small bed where Emma was still sleeping, her chest rising and falling steadily under the thin covers. She had come so far since that night in the city, and for the first time, Jake saw something in her he hadn't expected: peace. The weight of the world didn't seem to be pressing on her shoulders as much, at least not in this moment. He moved quietly, not wanting to disturb her, and went over to the window. The small town outside looked still, the quiet streets bathed in early morning light. It was peaceful, but Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way forever. The world they were moving through was full of uncertainty, and they had to keep going. He needed to protect Emma. It was that simple. Jake had lived a life full of twists and turns, and he wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he couldn't let her go through it alone. After a few minutes, Jake turned back toward the bed. Emma stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering as she slowly began to wake. He watched her, wondering what was going through her mind. She had been through so much, but there was a strength in her now, a quiet determination that made Jake feel hopeful for the first time in a long time. "Good morning," Jake said softly, his voice gentle. Emma blinked and then looked up at him. "Morning," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Jake could see the remnants of the little girl he had met, but there was something more to her now. She had grown. "Sleep okay?" he asked, moving toward the table to gather his things. Emma nodded. "Yeah, better than I have in a while," she replied, a slight smile tugging at her lips. Jake smiled back, feeling the warmth of the moment. For a second, it almost felt normal, like they were just two people sharing a quiet morning. But Jake knew better than to let his guard down. They were far from normal. They still had a long road ahead, and the world was still uncertain. After a few moments of silence, Jake broke it. "We'll head out soon. There's a place I know not too far from here. We can stop, get some gas, and figure out where we're going next." Emma nodded, and for a brief moment, Jake could see the curiosity in her eyes. She was still processing everything, still figuring out what kind of future they could have. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "I trust you." Jake's heart swelled at her words. She had already come so far. The ride ahead wouldn't be easy, but with her trust, with her presence, it felt a little more bearable. They got ready in silence, the weight of the unspoken understanding between them settling in. As they gathered their things, Jake glanced over at Emma. She was packing up her small bag, making sure she had everything she needed. Her movements were deliberate, careful, and Jake could sense the small but growing sense of independence in her. She wasn't the same girl who had been afraid to leave the city. She was learning to adapt, to trust, to believe that there was a way forward. They stepped outside, and the air was cool and crisp. The world outside felt fresh, like a clean slate waiting to be written on. Jake revved the engine of the bike, the sound filling the space between them. Emma climbed onto the back of the bike, and Jake couldn't help but notice how comfortable she looked now, like she belonged there. He held out the helmet to her, and she took it without hesitation, settling it on her head as she climbed behind him. "Ready?" Jake asked, turning slightly to look at her. Emma smiled, the kind of smile that was filled with quiet confidence. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady. Jake started the engine, and the world around them began to move again. As they rode, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over him. The world ahead was still uncertain, but for now, they were together. And together, they would face whatever came next. They rode through the morning, passing through towns and fields, the sound of the engine and the wind the only things that filled the silence between them. It was the kind of peaceful ride Jake hadn't had in years. The kind of ride that made him feel like everything would be okay. When they reached the gas station, Jake pulled up to the pump, cutting the engine. He helped Emma off the bike, and they went inside to pay for the gas. The cashier was friendly, a young woman with a warm smile, and she made small talk as Jake paid. It was strange, Jake thought, how easy it was to blend in here, in this small town. It felt like they were just another pair of travelers, not running from anything, not hiding. They were just two people trying to make it through the day. After they finished, they returned to the bike, and Jake could feel the weight of the moment. This was the first time they had truly been able to just stop. But the road was still ahead of them. As they rode out of town, the wind in their faces, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. They were moving forward, one step at a time, together.